stuff on a lot of things.
I do too.
Frank's right on, put on everything.
Yeah.
All right, how's everybody doing today?
Good, how are you?
Doing pretty well.
I'm awake.
A little busy.
Okay,
There we
come
go.
on.
All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. So I thought we were done with Kings, but we weren't. I forgot a couple of guys who you may have heard of, Elijah and Elisha. So I'm going to talk very briefly about them, and then we're going to actually get into today's topic as we continue to get behind on everything. So the stories of Elijah and Elisha, again, they're put together by the Deuteronomistic. By the end of this class, I will learn how to say Deuteronomistic historians without stumbling over things, but we have time. So these stories were put together based off folklore, most likely, about these two northern prophets, so the kingdom of Israel, Elijah and Elisha. And their two careers as prophets intertwined. Elisha is the divinely appointed successor to Elijah, and folklore kind of the folklore that was there gets kind of probably embellished a little bit by the historians. And what I mean by that is now Elijah is seen as sort of the new Moses. Elijah fulfills the promise made to Moses in Deuteronomy 18 that God is going to raise a prophet from up among them. And also, just like Moses, Elijah experiences a theophany on Mount Horeb. Elijah, there's a scene where he parts waters, builds an altar to God, spends 40 days and nights in the desert, this time fleeing Jezebel. And a major theme that we see in the Elijah narrative is this insistence on the worship of their one particular God, Yahweh, alone. And Elijah's name actually means my God is Yahweh. So Eli, God, and Jah for Yah, Elijah. And then we have that wonderful scene where there's Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. It's kind of storm god versus storm god. Who's the real God and who's able to light the fire in the storm? It's our God. And then there's this fascinating scene. This is a piece of, I think it's Dutch art about that. But when Elijah ascends, because Elijah doesn't die, he gets taken up by a fiery chariot, which has made all sorts of interesting fodder for the History Channel, among other places. It's obviously aliens. All right, so that is the actual end of getting into the Kings, at least in terms of what we're going to talk about today. So two very, very important prophets within the tradition. And now, moving into what are known as the major prophets. As a brief recap, the major prophets are Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And I suspect they're called major because they're sort of the long sections, right? They're very important in Israel and Judah's history, but they're also some of the longer books in the Hebrew Bible, if not the entire Bible. So we're now shifting from the northern kingdom back to the southern kingdom of Judah. And we're moving in time about a good century as we get into the major prophets. But we also see a shift where the narrative is now more closely matching historical figures who we're pretty sure were real and were prophets and were not sort of these more legendary figures like we've seen previously. Elijah was probably very much a real person, but we're starting to get to the point where we have people who can be attested to, or at least events that can be pretty closely attested to within the historical record outside of the Bible itself, which is sort of interesting. Starting with Isaiah, this is a book that is 66 chapters long. It's one of the longest books in the Bible, and until the 19th century, the whole thing was considered to be the work of the prophet, Isaiah, the son of Amos, who lived in Jerusalem and worked in Jerusalem in the 8th and early 7th centuries BCE. And while some early scholars saw some interesting things happening with the dating when they really looked at the text itself, it wasn't really until the 19th century amongst sort of German scholarship that they start to sort of delineate between the different sections of Isaiah, as you can see up there. And we'll get into that a little bit. But essentially there's first Isaiah, second Isaiah, or Deutero-Isaiah, and third Isaiah, or Trito-Isaiah. First Isaiah is chapters 1 through 39. The bulk of that can be dated to the prophet Isaiah in Jerusalem and is attested to being written by the prophet himself. And many scholars argue that these are the words, or at least the major thoughts of the prophet. Second Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55, is dated much later to the 6th century BCE. And then third Isaiah is dated a century or more further down the road still. So obviously, well, I guess I shouldn't say obviously, but probably obviously, an 8th to 7th century prophet probably is not going to have the particulars of events that were happening in the 6th century, like the details of the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon in 586, or the name of the Persian king Cyrus, who rises up and conquers Babylon in 539 and then sends the people back from exile. Well, unless, of course, he was really good at his job. And of course, that the arguments for more conservative traditions that think that Isaiah wrote the whole thing might make that argument that, well, no, this is his prophetic gift that he can name these things hundreds of years down the road. In our tradition and in critical scholarship, that is not the presumption, but just to put that out there. We next get to what's called the School of Isaiah. This is something that we'll see in other places, particularly in the New Testament with Paul, but there's this idea that particular figures will have such an impact that they will have disciples, right? And there will be almost like a theological school, if you will, based off of their work. And it's very similar to what we see with the Deuteronomistic historians. That's also a school, if you will, sort of a way of sort of common thoughts, things that are sort of passed down from teacher to student and keep things going. And actually in 1st Isaiah, there are references to those who are writing down the prophet's words, right? It's the idea that Isaiah is out there preaching and doing these acts of prophecy, but maybe not like sitting in an office writing them down. But there are people, sort of disciples of his, who are writing down and collecting the words that he has, making sure that his prophecies are going to be preserved into the future. And so these messages that the prophet delivers are now entrusted to his disciples, who are tasked with collecting and preserving all the oracles. And that's what we call these prophetic utterances. They're known as oracles. So you'll hear that word often today. And that's very similar to, again, these historians we've been talking about. They do kind of the same thing. And there's an argument that says that while this school continues to go on for quite a while, that they're creating and writing new material to add to the original collection of the 8th century prophet, right? So Isaiah keeps being kind of added to and edited along the way, even as whole new sections are being added as the centuries move on. And it's pretty remarkable that the school would have lasted for several centuries, and thus ensuring that the words of this particular prophet remain relevant, not just to the pre-exilic community, which he was a part of, but also to the exilic and even post-exilic communities that happened centuries after his death. And so let's start with 1st Isaiah. Just to kind of do some quick reminders of what's in the content and the arrangement of this first section of the prophet. There's some overlaps that we see in 1st Isaiah with Micah 4, Jeremiah 48, and then 2 Kings 18 through 20. As we start out in the first 12 chapters, it's an oracle against the northern kingdom of Israel, along with some both biographical and autobiographical narratives, but those are not listed in chronological order. So that's where you're going to find, for instance, his call narrative, the way in which God calls him to be a prophet. In chapters 13 through 23, we get oracles against foreign nations, those bad people over there. In 27 through 27, you have what's known as the Isaiah Apocalypse, which is this mythological account of divine judgment that's going to happen in the end times. We're going to start to see some apocalyptic thought as we get into these prophets. And that's probably dated much later to the 6th century and added on later, scholars argue. In chapters 28 through 33, we get a variety of oracles, and they're usually concerned with Judah and Ephraim. And Ephraim is another name for the northern kingdom of Egypt, named after the tribe of Ephraim. In the prophets, you'll see that. And actually, if you pay attention in the service today, you'll hear Ephraim. And if you're wondering about that, that's another name for the kingdom of Israel. So that'll come up in the Hosea text, I believe, that I'm preaching on this morning. And it's also very much concerned with these two kingdoms' relationships with Egypt. So Egypt is still kind of in play here, even as we're mostly thinking about, at this point, still the Assyrians, which is kind of interesting. If you remember that being stuck between these two empires, that's still very much in play in this time. And then in 36 to 39, we get some narrative that gets borrowed from 2 Kings that comes from our friends that we've been talking about a lot. And then we start talking about the prophet himself. His career starts in the reigns of the king Uzziah and lasts until the reign of Hezekiah in Judah. We find out that he was married. His wife was probably a prophet because she's sort of referred to as such. Some scholars have pointed out that it could just be that she was known as like Mrs. Prophet, like, you know, the traditions that had the First Lady, but that's probably an attempt to not give her a prophetic role. She probably was a prophet too. They were probably a clergy couple, so to speak, which is kind of cool. They had several kids who we know nothing about because the text doesn't care. You know, that happens. And probably served as a court prophet, sort of like how Nathan served in David's court, if you remember those stories. In terms of the message of Isaiah, I'm sorry, I mentioned earlier call story. There's no particular call story like we see with the other major prophets. It's a little different in this one. But there is an inaugural vision in chapter 6, which actually happens after he's already working as a prophet. So his call is different, right? We don't get the call to how he gets called to become a prophet. We get a call when he's already being a prophet that he needs to be doing something else. And that's when you get the tongs and the other thing. Because he's already professional clergy at that point. He's already got the robe and the stole and he's been working in the court. And then he gets this call to maybe say some other things that are not going to make him the most popular person. Because he's called to pronounce divine judgment, which is never a fun thing. And that section where this call happens gets interspersed with some lyrical passages, which are sort of interesting. One of the things that's different and sort of striking about Isaiah is there's this utter insistence on social justice. The reason from Isaiah's perspective that Jerusalem is going to be punished is because its leaders are corrupt and their corruption is harming the poor and the vulnerable, right? Like the justice only happens for the people who are wealthy. The people who are not wealthy are not being taken care of, and so therefore God is very angry at that, and that is the reason why these calamitous things are going to happen to you. And the other thing, and we'll see this throughout the major prophets, is that there's an understanding that God is the one who's responsible for historical events. So like when the Assyrians are at your door, when the Babylonians are at your door, there's a reason for that, and God is in control of that, right? It's not a good thing. And then you see a lot of the community trying to figure out why is it that God has let the Assyrians come to our front door? Why is it that the Babylonians are destroying our city? And so that's something that we'll see thematically in Isaiah and then also in the major prophets themselves. Moving on to Deutero-Isaiah. The question comes up, of course, how do we know that this should be considered as a separate piece of the book from a different time, right? Like why did the 19th century Germans kind of break this up in this way, and why do critical scholars today continue along that line of reasoning? Well, first of all, the historical context that we read about in these stories are completely different. Assyria is no longer listed as the enemy, but Babylon is. Jerusalem is not under threat. It has been destroyed. But there's a promise that one day it will be restored again. And then, of course, in First Isaiah, it's just we're under siege from this different group of people. But also what's different is how the prophet is mentioned. In First Isaiah, Isaiah is a major character and has both autobiographical and biographical accounts written, like things written about him and then things that seem to be written either by him or by his disciples about him, right? Lots of I statements. But when we get to second Isaiah, the speaker now is anonymous and we don't get any details about the prophet's life anymore, right? And then there's other historical details that are given in second Isaiah that would correspond to events happening in the mid-6th century. In terms of the structure of this section of Isaiah, it's really hard to delineate, and there's not really a scholarly consensus on how this should be structured. Most of the oracles that we read are poetry, which of course is hard to kind of put together in the ways you might like different types of narratives, like a historical narrative. So it's beautiful, but it's very poetic, and that's something that we'll tend to see in the prophets. There's a wide use of that genre of poetry in here. But we do see some similar themes. Second Isaiah tends to reuse a lot of biblical themes and references that we've already gotten familiar. The central and unifying theme is that of a new Exodus. And that is the promise of the immediate return from Babylon. Just as God led the people out of Egypt, God will lead the people out of Babylon. And there's this other figure in here known as the servant of God, or the servant of Yahweh. The servant is the chosen one who will bring justice through the world, but in a nonviolent way. The servant speaks to the entire world and identifies themselves as the one who's called by God from before birth to do this work, right? You know, God knew this particular person in the womb like being formed in a mother's womb. That's where that language comes from for this one very specific person. There's a confidence that's declared that divine help will happen even in the face of the persecution that people are facing. And there's a sense that this servant of Yahweh will suffer even though they were innocent. And that leads us to asking, okay, so who is this suffering servant? Who is this person? Is this an individual, as some people in the tradition have argued? And by that, I mean, that goes all the way back to when this was written. There's always been this question of who is 2nd Isaiah talking about here, right? Is this Moses who's going to come back? Is this a king like Hezekiah? Is this Jeremiah? Is this Cyrus the Persian? Who is being hoped for here? Is this a messianic figure who's going to come in the future? Now, of course, who have Christians identified this figure with?
Jesus.
Right. You know, from Handel and before that, of course, on up, Christians have tended to identify this particular anonymous figure with the person of Jesus. We should note that that specific title, servant of Yahweh, has been used in the past for other important individuals like Abraham, Moses, Joshua, David, and Job. So it's a title of someone who they were sort of looking forward to, but it's one that would have been known by the people, that there's this figure who's going to be coming to sort of lead them, and not just their particular people, but who's going to have an impact on the whole world. Now, the other identification is that this servant is not an individual, but like a specific historical individual, but a literary figure. And what I mean by that is there's a sense that it's possible that this could just be a personification of the nation itself, right? Of Judah and Israel as understood as an individual person. And that's something that we see throughout the biblical text, particularly in the prophetic texts. We'll again hear that today from the pulpit when God sort of picks up Israel like Israel's a little baby, right? You get kind of some of that personification. So there's still a question as to how that's interpreted, and different traditions going all the way back have seen that in different ways. But I think it's interesting. One of the other themes we start to see here is this growing sense of monotheism. And it's really here in 2nd Isaiah for the first time that there's a clear statement that God is God and God alone, right? Not that you worship God alongside Baal and Asherah, which is a problem that we're going to hear about, especially as we get into the minor prophets, but that God is the only God. Now, there's still kind of hedging as to whether or not other deities exist, right? But it's clear that the focus of worship is now on this one particular God, and that's the only God that really matters, right? So that's kind of an interesting development that we've seen moving through the texts. And then we get to Trito-Isaiah. Again, how do we know this should be considered different? We now read that Israel has been destroyed, and the promise to return is still there. So that sense that we had in 2nd Isaiah, but there's passages now where the temple is not only restored, but is functioning, and there's worship happening at the temple again. So especially with that language, this particular section is considered to be a product of the post-exilic period rather than the pre-exilic period or the exilic period. Most likely, this section can be dated to the latter part of the 6th century. We know the temple, we're not talking about the second temple, was completed in 515, so probably before that, or maybe even into the early 5th century. And its audience is no longer situated in Babylon, like we saw in 2nd Isaiah, but now is back in Judah. But again, it's difficult to date. This section likes to quote other biblical materials pretty loosely, and it's seen as sort of this collage of independent material that was sort of only really loosely related, that someone came together and put together. Sort of like what, if you remember back to Genesis, where there's all this different material that then gets kind of put together into a cohesive narrative. We see some of that happening in 3rd Isaiah. It's also, interestingly enough, a contemporary work of this time that we'll read about near the end of this, Ezra. Ezra is a very sort of nationalistic one, kind of, and we'll get into that in a minute, but it was very much the sense that you have to be separate from the people around you. Isaiah has a much more inclusive understanding of what the restored community is going to look like, to the point where even eunuchs are supposed to be included into the community, and that was sort of a big no-no in other sections, because there was a sense of purity that could not be achieved if you were someone who was not, if you were someone who was considered a eunuch. we can get into that later. But it's interesting how the perspective on who gets included in the community is much more inclusive than we see in other prophetic works. Now, let's do a little discursus. That's one of my favorite words, new words that I've learned in the last decade of my life. It means discussion. This is something that we see particularly in academic books where the author just wants to talk about something completely different that's probably related, but it's its own thing. So we're going to talk about history just for a minute here. And throughout the prophets, I'll kind of do these a little bit. So, the siege of Jerusalem. Because again, as I mentioned, these things are the writings that we have in Isaiah and the other prophets are tied to very specific historical events that are happening that we have evidence for outside of the text. One of those is this campaign of Tiglath-Pileser III, starting in around 734 BCE, where there's a siege of Jerusalem. And if you want to fact check me on that, just be careful. I was very curious when I was looking for images, and I looked up Siege of Jerusalem on Wikipedia, and there are a lot of different sieges of Jerusalem, according to Wikipedia, more so than I recognize going into very recently in modern history. So Jerusalem is a place that's had its share of conflict over the past 3,000 or 4,000 years, depending on how far back you want to look. But in this particular form of conflict, we have this Assyrian king who's moving into this part of ancient southwestern Asia known as the Levant to kind of reestablish control over some of the wee little kingdoms like Aram of Damascus and Israel and places like that. And so there's a coalition that gets formed to sort of fight this. And we start to see the nations of Tyre and Edom and Ashkelon coming together to sort of push back and prevent the Assyrians from asserting control and dominance in this area. But interestingly, Judah refuses to join them. We'll get into that in a little bit. And so to force Judah to join this coalition to fight the Assyrians, this coalition, which includes Israel at this point, lays siege to Jerusalem, right? So they attack Jerusalem to prevent Jerusalem and themselves from being attacked by the Assyrians. Because if you want to stop war, clearly the best way is with war. Anyway, so that's the Syro-Ephraimite War. And then, that's our friend Tiglath right there. It's a stela from the British Museum. That's too far. Keep talking. Okay, and then you have this new 20-year-old king of Judah known as Ahaz, who sees this army of people who are coming because they're mad at him for not joining an army, and he actually reaches out to Tiglath-Pileser because he needs help from this guy. So this conquering army is coming, and Judah, this new 20-year-old, decides to ally with them rather than with his neighbors, including Israel, becomes his vassal. And that's something that gets confirmed by Assyrian sources and condemned by biblical sources, as you might imagine, because that's not only a lack of trust that God's going to protect you, but according to the contemporaries in Judah, that's an act of apostasy. And we see that in Isaiah. So there's this confrontation, maybe that's too strong a word, but this encounter between Ahaz and Isaiah, and that's actually where the oracle of the birth of Emmanuel comes in, the one who's going to be the Prince of Peace, who's going to give peace and prosperity to Judah. But the king has rejected this, and now Emmanuel, who's still coming, is no longer seen so much as God's good news to save us, but God's sort of punishment of them, who will hand them into the hands of the Assyrians because he made this treaty that he was not supposed to do. And that leads to the Assyrian invasion of Judah in 701. We're now on to a new king, and even though this is, 33 years later, it's like 2 or 3 kings down the road to give you a sense for how stable Assyrian monarchies was. Also, just as an aside to my aside, Assyria is often considered to be one of the first true empires in world history, at least as we kind of understand empires today. So that's kind of interesting. It was and by that they mean like a multicultural, multinational coalition under one royal ruler. Here you have the prism. I've actually seen that. I went through Facebook because I don't have my early photos from seminary because they're on a laptop that doesn't work anymore. And I did not take a picture of that, but I have seen that. It's a 6-sided prism that talks about all the wonderful conquering that Sennacherib has done. And it talks about this in here. It describes Sennacherib's campaign in the Levant and that he accepts submission and tribute from most of the kings that he conquers. And then he punishes those who try not to submit, like Hezekiah of Judah, who now is not a fan of the Assyrians 30 years later and is trying to fight back against them. So there's this punishment that the king decides to bring to these these people of Judah. And there's also a very vivid description of the siege of Lachish in his prison, or in his prison, palace in Nineveh, which is this. So this would have been at the entrance of the palace, and as anyone came into Sennacherib's palace, they would be greeted with this very large scene of this Israelite, or this Judean city being wiped off the map, basically, as a sort of show of force. You know, like you do when you're on your way to your office, have a picture. People are, well, I was going to say people were a little different back then, but I sometimes wonder. Exactly. To do, have done, you know, cross that off. Okay, oh, too far. Okay. So that is kind of extra biblical evidence for these things happening. Within Scripture itself, going back to 2 Kings for a moment, in 18 through 20, there's an account of this invasion that's broken into a couple sources. The A source corresponds very closely to Sennacherib's account of this. And then the B source has sort of parallel accounts of communications between the prophet Hezekiah and Sennacherib, and implies, again, that if Assyria is at the gates, it's because God sent them to their gates, right? You did a bad thing, and this is what's coming for you. But there's also this assurance of don't be afraid, right? God is still with you, even though you're about to be wiped off the map by the Assyrians. And that doesn't actually happen at this point. They come to the gates, but this is not when Jerusalem falls. We'll get into that in a little bit. It's a tumultuous time for the people. Now, the northern kingdom has fallen at this point, and we will talk about that when we get into some of the minor prophets, because there's some more northern focused prophets, and we'll talk about that then. And then all the way in 2 Chronicles 32, there's some more details that talk about Hezekiah repairing and continue to fortify Jerusalem, and we see evidence for that in the archaeological record. And then in Isaiah 1, there's this poetic description of the devastation that would have happened then. Yeah, so that discursus, and that is Isaiah. How are we doing so far? Okay, Jeremiah. So the next of the three major prophets, probably arranged according to chronological order, at least when compared to first Isaiah, is Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is pretty complicated as a text. It seems to have been added onto and sort of rearranged over the years as things have gone on. And one of the things that's very interesting about that is there's actually a significant difference in the length of the text between what we now have as the Masoretic Hebrew and the Greek Septuagint. Now, kind of as a background reminder, I don't remember if we talked about this a lot. The Septuagint is the Greek language Hebrew Bible that was written in Alexandria. I want to say the earliest ones were probably late Second Temple period, so pretty close to around the time of Jesus. But the New Testament authors tend to quote from it because they read Greek, even the non-Jewish ones. And then you have the Masoretic text, which is sort of a continuation of the Hebrew Bible, but itself, with the vowel pointings, emerges actually in what we call the medieval period. Because we don't have texts that are... The texts that we have earlier for that, there's some fragments, there's some scrolls, there's actually some scrolls written on metal, which is sort of fascinating. But like a full, complete text in the Masoretic doesn't emerge till around 1000-ish, if I'm remembering correctly. But there's a difference between those two. The Greek is about 1/8 shorter than the Jeremiah that we have in the Masoretic text, and the second half of the text is actually arranged differently than the Masoretic. Shifts it around. There's also a difference that we see between the fragments of Jeremiah that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls and what's in the Masoretic Hebrew, which is interesting. Scholar Michael Coogan notes, quote, "It also reveals a kind of open-ended understanding, of a book. Rather than being a finished composition, it was something rather like a hypertext, which subsequent authors and edited felt free to revise and to expand." So we see even sort of from the time of the Second Temple period until sort of around 1000, there's still additions happening to Jeremiah, most likely. That's probably what we see happening in there. So it's very possible, since our Bibles and all English Bibles that I'm aware of use the Masoretic now, except maybe the King James, because that would have been I should stop talking because I don't know enough about the King James to know if they're using the Masoretic text or if they use a different text for their Textus Receptus. But the Bibles, at least that we are familiar with and we use in our tradition, are based off of that Masoretic. So the way that we read Jeremiah is probably different than the way that Jesus would have read Jeremiah, most likely, just because there's a difference that we know about in length, which I think is kind of interesting. But again, I don't know. We don't have evidence for what full Jeremiah in the Masoretic, in what will become the Masoretic text looked like in that time, because we don't have any of those scrolls aside from fragments. Anyway, I too much from the side.
John, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
That I don't think has an answer, but after you're talking about additions to the book of Jeremiah, it's at least decades after the body of Jeremiah is being written. Are those
Probably
additions?
centuries.
What's that?
Probably more centuries.
Well, and I was erring on the side of less time, but are those like considered corrections of that original text, or are they elaborations, as in sort of like, it would be neat to have this plot line sort of embellished by writing another few paragraphs or another couple pages. I'm wondering about the reason or the strategy behind adding well after the original corpus of a chapter.
So the actual answer is I have no idea.
That's what
But I'm happy to speculate. And what I might speculate is that it's more of sort of an elaboration on. And that's actually something we see like in the Gospel of Matthew, right? No, sorry, Mark, right? You remember there are 3 endings to Mark? There's the original ending to Mark that people are like, oh, no, that's not going to work. And then so there's another ending to Mark and people are like, well, not quite there. And then, and this is probably a good century after Mark was written. And then we get to the sort of the longer one, and people in the scribal communities and early churches like, that's the one. So I suspect that, I would guess it's probably like that, but I don't know. So that's me speculating. Okay, so in terms of the prophet himself, he had a pretty long career, going from 627 to the fall of Jerusalem in 586. He was a priest from a little town called Anathoth, which is a small village just a few miles north of the big city of Jerusalem. So, suburban kid. Well, actually, probably, back then, small town kid, because, a few miles was a long commute back when you're on foot. Scholars used to argue that Jeremiah was a historical person, that, everything that gets written about him is what happened, but now there's some doubt. Some scholars think that the Jeremiah that we read, that we meet in the book, has probably become more of a literary character than the actual historical Jeremiah at this point. Now, that being said, we do know that Jeremiah was a historical person who lived in the 7th to 6th centuries, a person who had been deeply involved in the politics of his day and paid a pretty high price for that, including imprisonment and exile. And so there's some scholars who argue that even though he has become a literary figure in the way that other historical figures have become literary figures. A good example of that is Socrates, right? Socrates was a person who existed and did philosophy. Plato uses him as a character to get his point across in the dialogues. So I've seen a comparison that biblical scholars have made between Jeremiah and Socrates in that way, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So the structure of Jeremiah. The first 25 chapters are kind of what we would consider to be the main body, the main collection. It's mostly poetic oracles that are against Judah and Jerusalem and the people who live there. It starts with what is considered to be sort of a typical editorial introduction. Someone came by later and sort of writes this introduction to it. And that's also where we get the call story of the prophet, which we would expect to be there. And that kind of introduction introduces some themes that we'll see throughout the prophet. And then the material that follows doesn't seem to be any real order. It's kind of like this random collection of oracles of judgment and lament with a little bit of prose, speeches, and narrative kind of sprinkled in there. In chapters 26 through 29, we have prose narratives, which now are associated with dates. I wrote in my notes dated prose narratives, and I assume that's what I mean, as opposed to they just seem really old and we don't care about them anymore. It's fun when you have different same words meaning different things, which also is something that we see in biblical interpretation, but that's a whole nother thing. So the narratives we see here are encounters between Jeremiah and the man, right? Jeremiah and the establishment do not get along well, including the other sort of professional prophets. Jeremiah is a bit of an outlier. In chapters 30 through 33, we get what's called the Book of Consolation. These are passages of hope and comfort for the future. And that's something that we see in earlier prophets as well. And there are some affinities to some of the second Isaiah oracles that are most likely from the 6th century. In chapters 34 through 45, we get, again, more prose. This part most likely dating to the reign of Zedekiah, which happens after the fall of Jerusalem in 526. In chapters 46 through 51, we get some more oracles to the nations, like we remember from Isaiah, similar to also what Amos and Ezekiel do. And it's kind of everybody, right? There are oracles against Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Aram, Damascus, Transjordan, a couple of Arabian tribes, Kedar and Hazar, Elam, I don't know what Elam did, but they're on the list, and Babylon. So basically, everybody sort of gets it a little bit from Jeremiah. And then we also see that the longest oracles against the nations are those that just happen to be the biggest threats to Judah. So Egypt, Edom, and Babylon get the largest oracles against them in there. Okay, material in Jeremiah. There are sort of three major types that were identified, particularly in the 20th century, by biblical scholars. The first type, known as Source A, are poetic oracles that were thought to be composed by Jeremiah, or at least spoken by Jeremiah and then written down later. Source B are biographical narratives about the prophet that were possibly written by Jeremiah's scribe named Baruch. So the things that are about him get written down by a scribe. And then source C are later Deuteronomistic editing and expansion. There's some prose discourse that gets directly attributed to the prophet, but most likely was not from him. But again, scholars are now kind of more in debate about how much of this can actually be linked to the prophet, of these things that were later added that they said, well, the prophet said this. And it's like, well, maybe, because that's what you're trying to say in that. But so there's a little bit more debate around that than there might have been more in antiquity. And this part I find pretty interesting. Jeremiah and this Deuteronomistic school. So it's clear that these historians or the school edited Jeremiah. Jeremiah was actually a contemporary of Josiah and his reform, and Josiah's reform was inspired very much by these historians in this particular school. One of the things we see throughout Jeremiah is the sorts of phrasing that are actually very typical of the book of Deuteronomy. So for instance, particularly in the prose. So for instance, Egypt in both is referred to as an iron furnace. You have this phrase that both like to use, the mighty hand and outstretched arm of God. And they have the same theological perspective on divine justice. But at the same time, we get this expressed disillusionment with the failures of Josiah's reform. Ironically, we see the language of Deuteronomy getting reversed because of Israel's failure and Judah's failure to keep the commandments, right? So the choice that we see previously between, do this and you'll get blessing in life, and don't do this and there'll be a curse and death, is now reduced to do this and you will survive. Don't do this and you will not, right? The stakes are a lot higher. In terms of the message of Jeremiah, it's one that's complex. Its perspectives can at times seem pretty inconsistent. So it's possible, and I would argue probable, that this message changed along with the changing political context in Judah at the time. Here's what I mean by that. So at first we see this encouragement of the reforms that are happening under the King Josiah. There's this message of repentance and divine reward, right? If we turn around, God's going to bless us. And then that reform fails, and Josiah dies, and the message is now one of inexorable doom. But there's still some hope that God's not going to entirely abandon the people even as they meet this fate. If you remember from last time, we talked about the unconditional covenant that David had with God, that was supposed to be everlasting. Well, now there's sort of a reinterpretation of that covenant that argues that covenant does not guarantee that Judah itself is going to survive, but rather survival depends on observance of the Sinai covenant that sort of was thought to be under Moses and the Ten Commandments, right? So if you go back to what God told you earlier, you will survive. But because of the things you've been doing, that kind of sense of eternal blessing is kind of out the window. Because from the prophet's perspective, instead of doing what they're supposed to be doing. The Judeans trust rather not in God, but on this royal ideology, which we talked about very briefly last time. And thus they steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in my house, which is called by my name, and say, we are safe, in Jeremiah 7. So there's this thing that's saying that you have basically abandoned me, you're doing all these bad things, and you're still going to come to the temple and be like, oh, we're fine, God's protecting us, even though we've abandoned God entirely. And yet, even still, Jeremiah is very much seen as a minority voice. As several thousand nobility and religious leaders and sort of the elites under Judah, particularly those living in Jerusalem, get sent into exile under King Jehoiakim. You don't believe me that I took Hebrew, did you? It's been long enough. To be fair, I was never good with transliteration. I'm actually better with the Hebrew itself. I should probably just write it all out in Hebrew. I might have a better chance of pronouncing these names. Anyway, when that happened in 597, the other court prophet said, oh, this is going to be quick. You're going to be right back after a few years. This is going to be fine. But Jeremiah said, no, this is your punishment. But this is where we get, you know the line, seek the peace of the city, I will send you. That's where this comes from. So what the other prophets are saying, no, this is going to be fine. You'll be back in a little bit, resist, whatever. Jeremiah is saying, no, this is going to be for the long run. So you better just make the best lives you can for yourselves in this new context, because this is happening. We're not getting away from this. Which did not make him super popular. But in the midst of this inescapable divine judgment that Jeremiah is reminding them is in the process of happening, there's still this hopeful counterpoint in Jeremiah, and one that we see throughout the book. There's this message of hope going back to that covenant where Israel is seen where God is seen both as the husband and the parent of Israel, using those metaphors. And again, I don't know why I'm plugging my sermon this much, but we'll see a lot of that in the text that I preach on today, the parental metaphors especially. Whew. Okay, 2 minutes to choir. How are you all doing? All right, speed run through Ezekiel. So this guy's weird. He's the most unusual of all the major prophets, or really of prophetic literature in general. There was actually, to the point where there's controversy amongst the rabbis and other religious authorities as to whether or not this should be canonized into Jewish scripture. Right. So this is kind of like what John was for the Gospels. This is for the prophets. Because John, there was controversy about whether or not the Gospel of John had any business being in the Bible, also, which we'll get into later. We see in Ezekiel this sort of elaborate and fantastic visions that the prophet seems to have, but also there's this more orderly arrangement than we have in other similarly prophetic books. So the stuff that happens is out there, but it's organized decently in an order, which we Presbyterians appreciate. He's even referred to as a surrealist, which is sort of fascinating, but also very much an optimist, because he seems to believe that God and Israel's relationship one day will be restored. Within his call, he's presented with a scroll that is this message that he's supposed to deliver, and he's instructed to eat it, and he eats it, and the words on the scroll are terrible, but the scroll itself is sweet and delicious. That is, of course, a metaphor, right? But that's the sort of thing that we encounter in this prophet. A lot of sort of really interesting vision and metaphor. Other bizarre behavior and visions that we read about include being speechless for a while, lying down on his side for lengthy periods, shaving his head, eating while trembling, packing a bag and pretending to go into exile, not mourning for his deceased wife. And this has led contemporary scholars to wonder about how he was doing, right? Is this a person who was living with mental or even physical illness? And so some scholars try to make the argument that this is a person most likely who had schizophrenia or epilepsy. The book is, unlike what we've seen before, this book is almost entirely written in the first person. There's only kind of at the very beginning into chapter 3 do we see the third person ever happening as sort of an editorial note. Now, the prophet. This was a prophet who he'd been a priest in Jerusalem and was sent into exile in 597. So as Jeremiah is seeing these people getting packed up and leaving, Ezekiel is one of those people who's being packed up and sent off. So he gets exiled in the first wave of exiles along with the elite of Judah. and therefore he's a contemporary of Jeremiah, but has a much different perspective and context because he is a prophet speaking from the exile. Most scholars tend to take the autobiographical information about Ezekiel at face value and argue that he is the author of these oracles. The chronology that we see in the book is consistent with other things that we know about the prophet. And while there's no references to datable people or events after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, which ended in 562, which is kind of interesting, but otherwise we're pretty sure that this is who this is, and he wrote and thought these things. One of the things that's fascinating is that his career takes place completely in Babylonia. He's the first prophet who gets called outside of the promised land, which is sort of interesting. And he doesn't experience his first prophetic revelation until the 5th year of exile. So he was probably 30 at the time, by the time he sort of gets called to go into ministry, which sort of makes me feel better about that sort of thing. And that's actually important because one of the things that we start to see in Ezekiel is the sense that the divine presence is now with the people in exile and no longer tied to the land or the temple. That's kind of where this starts to get developed. And all of this bizarreness and possible mental or physical illness aside, it's very clear that he's incredibly well educated and very deeply rooted in the priestly traditions of the temple. So we now have a connection where Jeremiah had a connection to D. This is a connection to P. And if you're in the choir, you're welcome to leave at any time. I will not hold you, but I'm going to keep going. He was a very creative writer. He's a visionary and a mystic. Unlike Jeremiah, who witnesses the destruction of Jerusalem, he's already in exile and thus hears from it later. And we'll just end it there. And we'll talk about it later. I got some more to go, then we'll get some other things.
Half your class leaves.
Yep. I don't want you to miss it because this is fun. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Can
have a
I ask a
question.
couple
Yeah.
of random questions?
Oh, hang on.
Sorry.
When did Jeremiah become a bullfrog?
When does Jeremiah become a what?
A bullfrog. Jeremiah.
Because he was a good friend of mine.
Got it.
That is a good question. I think there's some scholarly debate about that currently. And Chip, you had Oh,
I
sorry.
couldn't, I had to say that, because running in my
Yeah.
head. Had to get rid of it.
Yeah, it's distracting, I know.
Distracting.